International law is very relevant for protected areas. There are different forms of international law: treaties, conventions, protocols, declarations, action plans, resolutions, memoranda of understanding, and principles can all be part of international law. International law can be binding or non-binding. Legally binding international law is called hard law. Treaties, conventions, and protocols are one type of hard law. These are all different names for a written agreement that is intended to be legally binding. Another type of hard law is customary international law. Principles and norms are considered customary international law where there is evidence of general practice and acceptance of an obligation to be bound. International law can also be non-binding. This is called soft law. Non-binding declarations, action plans, resolutions, and memoranda of understanding are all types of soft law. Soft law does not create binding obligations on states, but it can provide standards and guidance for conservation. Sometimes, soft law can become hard law. When soft law principles are followed by states in practice, in a way that shows acceptance of obligation to be bound, they can become customary international law. Or, soft law principles can be written into agreements or adopted by treaty bodies as legally binding decisions. International agreements are particularly important in the context of protected areas. Global and regional agreements addressing environmental issues are often called multilateral environmental agreements, or MEAs. Some MEAs focus on a specific type of species or ecosystem, such as the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands of International Importance. Others have a wider scope, like the Convention on Biological Diversity, which provides a broad framework for conservation. Several MEAs create specific obligations or guidelines relating to protected areas. The Convention on Biological Diversity identifies protected areas as a key mechanism for meeting the objectives of biodiversity conservation. It calls on countries to establish a system of protected areas and develop guidelines for the selection, establishment, and management of protected areas. The parties of the Convention on Biological Diversity have set global targets for biodiversity conservation, the Aichi targets. Aichi Target 11 calls for conservation of 17% of terrestrial and inland water areas and 10% of coastal and marine areas through protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures by the year 2020. The World Heritage Convention creates a system to identify and protect sites of outstanding universal value. Outstanding geological formations, significant natural habitats, important conservation sites, and areas of exceptional natural beauty can all be listed as World Heritage Sites. World Heritage Sites can include and overlap with many categories of protected areas. The Ramsar Convention on Wetlands of International Importance also creates a list of designated sites. These Ramsar sites are often legally established as protected areas. The Ramsar Convention also requires countries to promote wise use of all wetlands, whether they are listed sites or not, and to establish nature reserves on wetlands within their territory. The Convention on Migratory Species creates a framework for international cooperation to protect wildlife species that migrate between countries. Countries that are part of the range of one of the listed species must enter into an agreement to conserve that species, including through protected areas. For example, the agreement on the conservation of seals in the Wadden Sea between Denmark, Germany, and the Netherlands talks about the necessity of creating a network of protected areas. Many other international agreements are relevant to protected areas, including the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Non-Navigational Uses of International Watercourses, the UNECE Convention on the Protection and Use of Transboundary Watercourses and International Lakes, and many regional agreements and instruments such as the African Convention on the Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources, the European Habitats and Birds Directives, and the Convention on Nature Protection and Wildlife Preservation in the Western Hemisphere. These international agreements create binding obligations that countries must fulfill. They also provide standards and guidance to countries for establishing and managing protected areas.